to our next session, which is about reimbursement. I see our presenter online, Dr. Renée Arnold. So I'm very happy to turn the session over to Renée, who is an entrepreneur in residence at the NHLBI within the Innovation and Commercialization Office. For those of you that have been involved with Catalyze for a few years, you'll absolutely recognize Renée. I rely on her quite a bit for different webinar opportunities and annual meetings. So she is one of my frequent flyers, and I very much appreciate her expertise and willingness to contribute. So Renée, I know you want to share your slides. Is that correct?
I do. Thanks, Marissa. Let me find that. Okay, it's a good start. Now, can I put them in presentation mode? Yes, okay, that's also another good start. Okay, great. So thanks so much, Marissa. The idea here is to provide a very basic understanding of the structure of the U.S. healthcare system and components of reimbursement. We're all Americans here, or at least we're affiliated with the U.S., especially those of you that are Catalyze awardees, so congratulations to you for that, and understand how complex healthcare is in the United States. We are not a single payer. We've got so many hundreds of payers. And as a result, we have reimbursement codes that are often very difficult to understand. How does your technology get reimbursed? You have a reimbursement code. Hey, that's good. You're set to go. No, not necessarily. And so I'm here to tell you what you have to think about and how to go about understanding coverage coding and payment. The first thing to understand is that all of this is very dependent upon evidence. And you've all been talking about evidence development within your projects. The first thing that's important is to determine that there's an unmet need. If you're lucky, the unmet need has already been established for you in publication. If not, you may have to do retrospective database analyses or some other types of analyses to demonstrate that your technology is not looking for an unmet need, but that there is an unmet need that will be supported by your technology. And this could be as straightforward as you intend to be the 10th of 10 asthma medications or devices out there, but you've been able to demonstrate, or others have already demonstrated, that there's a need for your technology. Patients are not being well supported by current technologies. They're being hospitalized. They're in ICUs. They're unable to get to step-down therapy. Their quality of life is not optimized. And how much is the cost of an episode of care? An episode of care could be as straightforward as it's not just the time that they're in the hospital. It could be from before they're hospitalized, through the hospitalization, and then post-hospitalization. What impact will your product have on the cost of an episode of care? How do you plan to quantify that improvement in health outcomes via resource use, reduced hospital days, ability to step down from the ICU, improvement in unscheduled clinic visits, improvement in patient-reported outcomes such as quality of life? What are your health economic endpoints? Is there a quality of life aspect to your technology? And if so, people don't realize, and this is especially the case for oncology technologies, you can get a quality of life indication, but it behooves you to use at least one validated instrument that the FDA prefers to see, so that when you've demonstrated that improved quality of life, you're using the preferred methodology to do that. So let's talk about this very complex US healthcare system and how it contributes to the complexity for reimbursement, but also gives you an idea in terms of what you need to think about in terms of reimbursement of your technology. I actually just updated this graph recently, actually last night, when I looked to see that I had an old graph. But what still stands out, and it was the same as the graph that was a few years old, the US outspends other countries up to fivefold. Yet our life expectancy is no better, and in many cases worse. So if our average spend per patient is $10,000 in the US currently, but yet our life expectancy is really no better than, for example, Costa Rica, that spends a fifth per capita on healthcare outcomes. There are ways that people are considering how to reduce cost, but yet improve health outcomes. Notwithstanding repealing the Affordable Care Act or the ACA to reduce federal Medicaid spending, if people, I hesitate to say, watch the debate, that was front and center. And we seem to have not been able to come out with anything better than the Affordable Care Act at this point. Progressive payment models to better align reimbursement to patient outcomes. As a matter of fact, by 2030, Medicare expects to have all outcomes according to value-based pricing and not fee-for-service, which a lot is still fee-for-service at this point. As a result of needing evidence development to support value-based pricing and improve patient outcomes, there's an increasing focus by payers on health economics and cost-effectiveness analysis. And there are various proposals to reduce drug spend. And most recently, successfully, the Inflation Reduction Act allowed Medicare to negotiate drug prices for the first time. And it really was ridiculous that Medicare, that has so many patients enrolled in it, we were not allowed to negotiate drug prices for the elderly. It's important to determine what types of insurers you're interested in influencing, or which will influence your reimbursement for your technology. About 50% of patients are covered by employers, so commercial insurance. And then you've got a certain amount, another 34% or so, that are covered by Medicaid and Medicare. Then there's the VA, military, et cetera. So speaking of Medicare, you probably know that it was a federal mandate that began in 1965. It's the federal health insurance program for people 65 and older. So it's funny that it started in 65. It's for patients 65 and older, and also certain younger people with disabilities and end-stage renal disease. There are 4 parts to Medicare. Part A, hospital insurance, covers primarily inpatient hospital stays. Part B is medical insurance, which covers outpatient care and doctor visits. Part C is Medicare Advantage plans. Parts A and B benefits are administered by commercial payers. And Part D, which started in 2006, is prescription drug coverage. Medicare currently insures more than 62 million Americans. So if you think about there being more or less 300 million Americans, that's about a fifth of the country. The majority is still fee-for-service, as you can see at this pie chart, about 61%, but catching up quickly is Medicare Advantage, or Part C. The problem with Medicare Advantage is it was meant to be cost-saving, but not reducing the quality of patient care outcomes. That hasn't always been the case. And we're trying very hard to incorporate, again, this value-based care component and improve patient outcomes into cost savings, but it's been very difficult to do. In terms of coverage, there are several different kinds of coverage decisions that you need to be aware of that are administered through Medicare by entities called MACs, or Medicare Administrative Contractors, MACs, that process claims, define parameters for coverage, and set payment rates locally. So there are 2 kinds of coverage determinations. One that's very difficult to get national coverage determinations, so our coverage decisions at national levels. But if you're not able to get covered nationally, it may quash you from getting covered locally. So even though it may be more difficult from a time and evidence development standpoint, a lot of people will go with or will look for local coverage determinations through these different MACs. And there is a MAC that in particular, so these are the different MACs, Medicare Administrative Contractors, that cover patients locally. But not all MACs are created equal. Palmetto, which is in the Mid-Atlantic region here, you think, well, it just covers a few states, but it's very influential. It's the key US CMS contractor for pricing, data analysis, and coding, which is known as PDAC, to secure US reimbursement codes. And as goes Palmetto, so goes a lot of the other MACs. So if you're successful in getting a reimbursement code at the level that you're hoping to get it at with Palmetto, a lot of the other MACs will follow suit. And that's how you'll get your national coverage determination. Start locally and then go not really globally, but US-wide. So that was parts A and B, really. There are also specific MACs for molecular diagnostics or MolDX. There again, Palmetto is key, and the other MACs will follow Palmetto's coverage determinations. There are also different MACs that are specific for durable medical equipment. And then, so that was all about Medicare. Medicaid, unlike it being a federally mandated system, is jointly funded by the Fed and by the states. And as a result, every state, and this really is a mess, has different flavors of what is covered under their Medicaid programs. Not only is Medicaid different in its coverage from state to state, but even within states, it can be county to county. It could be little locale to little locale. You cross the street and you have different coverage. Each state manages their own Medicaid program, including eligibility criteria. The ACA allowed individual states the option of whether or not to expand Medicaid to certain individuals, depending on where they fell along the federal poverty line. 30 states chose to expand Medicaid, 20 states chose not to expand Medicaid. As of April 2021, more than 80 million people are covered by Medicaid, but this is in contrast to 4 years prior, where 69 million people were covered. And I think you can guess what happened around 2020, 2021, the pandemic. And a lot of the states chose to increase coverage because patients were so wanting because of the pandemic. The government foots a certain amount of the bill, and it has readily decreased from 100% initially to now it still covers about 90% of each state's bill. Approximately 180 million patients are covered under commercial insurance. And this is managed under more than 900 different commercial plans in the United States, about 50% of which are Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm going rather quickly through these slides, but I'm hoping to be able to take questions, and that's why I'm doing this. You will have these slides available to you after the presentation. And if you have questions, I'm sure Marissa will figure out how to get you in touch with me or somebody else that can answer your questions. But the blues are particularly influential in terms of the percentage of covered lives that they encompass, and the fact that different commercial payers have varying evidence thresholds for coverage. But the Blues plan, Blue Cross Blue Shield, tends to hold the evidence to a higher bar. And you can see, and hopefully when I'm telling you this looks turquoise to me, it's looking turquoise to you. But anywhere you see true, these are Blues plans. These are patients that are covered under Blues, whether they're nationwide or they're regional in the orange here. So it's a lot of times if people say they don't know where to start with coverage, how do I know what evidence I need to include in my clinical trials? What kind of endpoints are insurers looking for? A lot of this is publicly available. You can Google, and I'll give you an example a little later on in the presentation of something that I did in my personal life to help my sister-in-law get her son covered under one of the Blues plans. And all I did was Google coverage policy for this particular type of therapy. I was able to see what was covered, what wasn't covered, how it was covered, and then ultimately to get them covered, because she was lamenting to me how expensive this was. They wouldn't be able to afford it. And I said, well, guess what I do for a living? Evidence development and support of coverage. Let me see what I can do. So this isn't just theoretical. If you Google coverage policy for either your technology or a competitor, it will give you a really good idea of what is covered and what evidence is required. One of the ways that the healthcare system is trying to improve patient outcomes and save money is by the use of accountable care organizations. ACOs have been in existence for quite some time now, and this is an old graph, but the reason why I kept this in here is because at the end of 2016, there were about 900 ACOs. As of 2024, there are approximately 1,800. And unlike traditional fee-for-service payment models that pay providers for each service delivered, an ACO directly ties payment levels to patient outcomes, thereby incentivizing improved clinical outcomes and minimizing provider costs. Providers do take a chance if they're involved in ACOs, and you can see that the majority of them are Medicare ACOs, but the providers go at risk for a patient's entire care if they have enrolled the patient in their ACO. And what I mean by going at risk is that, let's say you're a cardiologist or the provider is a cardiologist, they've enrolled this patient in the ACO, but the patient also has diabetes, they're also obese, maybe they have end-stage renal disease. So unfortunately, as patients get older, they don't typically just have one chronic illness, they often have more than one. And the provider is going at risk for managing the entire patient, the total patient, and not just their cardiovascular care, even though this is a cardiologist, for example. But ACOs are growing. They're, again, as you saw, just going from in 8 years, from 2016 to 24, the number of ACOs doubled. So this is definitely one of the ways in which the healthcare system is trying to provide value-based care. So let's talk about some regulatory requirements and reimbursement. The most important factor in payers' determination of how to reimburse a technology is its regulatory pathway, not the center granting approval. So whether it's CBER or CDER is not so important. It's the regulatory pathway. So perhaps you've heard talk of 510Ks or de novo pathways. 510K is if your technology is considerably similar to what's already available. It doesn't mean that you'll need no clinical evidence, but probably very little clinical evidence because the innovator has already provided the clinical evidence. It takes much longer often to get a de novo designation for your regulatory approval. But it may be worthwhile because your reimbursement may be higher using a de novo pathway. I wanted to spend the majority of our time on reimbursement codes, settings of care, and how these reimbursement codes vary according to settings of care. I think a lot of people are confused by reimbursement codes. There are a lot of different kinds of codes that your technology may be subject to. Probably one of the most common codes is called the CPT code, Current Procedural Terminology Code. These are administered by the AMA and modified by the AMA as need be. And this is mostly seen in physician offices. There are some inpatient CPT codes, but most of them are outpatient, surgical center, etc. Then there are other types of outpatient codes that are other than CPT codes called HCPCS codes, Healthcare Common Procedure Coding System. Please don't call it HCPCS. It makes me crazy. There's no S here. It's HCPCS codes, which are administered by CMS. And these are also outpatient, but for example, often lab tests are involved with HCPCS codes. From an inpatient standpoint, we're talking about what you're probably familiar with, ICD-9, ICD-10, and as of a couple of years ago, ICD-11 codes. So these are disease-specific codes. And as we've gone up in number from ICD-9 to all the way to ICD-11, the number of codes have exploded, with the idea that the more codes there are available, the more descriptive these codes can be. And I'm sure you know that a lot of provider offices have people that are specifically there to provide codes and to work with insurance companies. And it's probably not the most appealing use of an FTE, but it's often necessary to get reimbursed. So there are different categories of CPT codes, categories 1 to 3. The ones that most people will be either familiar with or will want is a category 1 code. And that's where the majority of insurers will reimburse if you have a category 1 code. If there's not a CPT code available yet, or your technology is somewhat experimental, you're stuck with a category 3 code. The problem with category 3 codes is because they are considered experimental by insurers, they are often not covered. So the idea is if you don't have enough evidence initially to go from a category 3 to a category 1 code, you try to gather that evidence, and then eventually it may take you 2 to 3 years to actually get a reimbursable category 1 code. But that's what you have to go through. And there are a lot of other things in terms, including getting endorsement from specialty organizations, having them vouch for you that your technology should be reimbursable, for example. But there are programs that the FDA is putting into place, for example, called TCET, which is, if it's not, I don't think it's law yet, but it's very shortly going to be legislatively available, so that if your technology, your device has a breakthrough designation, you're more likely to be initially reimbursable as you then gather evidence. So this is a category of coverage with evidence development, that you can get coverage initially, and then you are able to, with that coverage, develop the evidence that will give you your category 1 code. So as if that wasn't all confusing enough, CMS has Medicare physician fee schedules that list physician payment rates by these different CPT codes, but they vary by if the setting of care is in a facility, such as a hospital and an ASC, nursing home, etc., or if it's in a non-facility, which is in a physician's office. So you can see here, this is why we end up needing coding professionals in offices, that you have physician services, then you have different coding systems, And then these differ by if it was an inpatient hospital stay, more than 2 midnight stays. I don't know how people came up with that. Outpatient hospital, durable medical equipment, laboratory diagnoses, diagnostics. Then you have the different coding schedules that we talked about, which Medicare system is employed, and if it's a commercial system, what is employed. There is an interplay of different reimbursement components. And I know I'm going quickly, so I'm going to try to slow down a little bit, but I did want to have time for questions, hopefully. So you have national and state legislation that can influence payer benefit design that ultimately will influence an insurer's coding, coverage policy, and payment. That will then influence clinical positioning, your value proposition, and then the evidence base that's required. So you start going first down, but then you really go back up. What evidence base will provide you with your value proposition? And when you start thinking about a value proposition, which if you don't know too much about it now, you sure will pretty soon, it starts out being aspirational. What do you want to be able to say about your technology? And then what evidence do you need to be able to support what you want to be able to say? Your value proposition will then influence your clinical positioning, which will then influence coverage, coding, and payment. But again, one of the most important pieces of information that will influence your reimbursability is evidence. And speaking of evidence, a key component is called clinical utility. And this is primarily of interest if you have a test or a device. Positive clinical utility encompasses improved patient outcomes. And you say, well, I don't have any of this information yet. I don't know about hospital readmission or length of stay, or I don't have evidence of my patients' improved activities of daily living. Well, while you go about developing that evidence using RCTs or observational studies, which could be prospective or retrospective, you can ask clinicians, how do you think that my new technology is going to influence your practice? How do you think it's going to hopefully improve patient-focused endpoints, such as hospital admission, readmission, and length of stay, and why? And this will also give you an idea of how to go about developing your clinical trials. What kinds of patient outcomes, again, such as ADLs, PROs. So we talked about using validated quality of life instruments to support indications, but it can also support clinical utility. And do you believe that my practice will be improved and patient outcomes will be improved? And why? What makes you believe that? Now, you probably will have at least preclinical data. You're going to have some kind of evidence. It can't just be pie in the sky, but you can ask clinicians to help you in developing this clinical utility argument that, again, is often in need by if you have a diagnostic test or a device that you would like to have reimbursed. So I've been talking quite a bit about coding, coverage, and payment, interplay of reimbursement components of a successful reimbursement strategy. This is central to developing a successful strategy. So from a coding standpoint, on the lower left here, are there specific codes, pre-existing codes preferably, for physicians and hospitals that accurately describe the service? From a coverage standpoint, does the technology improve patient outcomes? And you've been able to demonstrate this. And then from a payment standpoint, do third-party payers provide competitive reimbursement that supports the manufacturer's price of the product? one of the things I learned early on in my consulting practices, and I've never worked for a pharmaceutical company. I've only worked in consulting, and I find consulting very interesting. But when I've had clients come to me and say, well, we're just getting FDA approval and we're so excited and we have a code, so we know we're all set. Not necessarily, not so fast. First of all, if you have a code, that's a good start, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be covered. And so that's when I was talking about the different types of coverage policies. You need to understand, maybe start with the blues. Again, they require the highest level of evidence. And there are some very large blues, large states, as you can imagine, that are very influential. California, Southern California has a very specific methodology for determining coverage of many of the blues plan in Southern Cal. Florida, Texas, some of the big states that have a lot of patients, as I was showing you in that landscape coverage policy review. It's a good place to start. So do you have the coding? Then do you have the coverage? And then based on the coverage, will this payment actually support your technology? Maybe somebody wants to stick you, Medicare administrative contractor wants to stick you with a code that will not cover the payment that will give you the ROI that you're looking for, that will cover your cost of goods sold and give you enough of a profit margin that you can be an ongoing concern. So it's necessary to think about all of these things, and the earlier you start thinking about this, the better. So as Marissa mentioned, I'm part of NHLBI's Innovation and Commercialization Office. And I'm fortunate enough to work with people that have expertise in intellectual property, in clinical trials, in investability. The HEOR, Health Economics and Outcomes Research / reimbursement strategist. And we talk to people that have gotten, entrepreneurs that have gotten primarily SBIR and STTR grants about going to investment conferences. Okay, you've got a phase 2 grant. Now, in addition to your non-dilutive funding that you've been able to get from the NIH, how do you go about getting dilutive funding? Now you've got to get out of your own head about your technology and start thinking about the commercializability. And of course, ultimately, that's the whole idea of this, is to bring your technology first to the American public, hopefully, to be a public health positive, and then globally. And there are many different things that we want the entrepreneurs to consider when they're going to these investment conferences. As I mentioned, unmet need that needs to be quantified, and you need to demonstrate how you're planning on positively impacting unmet need. Either that's in the peer-reviewed clinical literature, you might find it in professional society guidelines, independent technology assessments. You've got physicians and key opinion leaders, so influencers aren't just on Facebook. I think Facebook is old now, Instagram, whatever else is out there. And there are political forces and legislation, and all of these forces will influence the payer in terms of their coverage decisions. But one of the things I started to tell you about with the work that we do in coaching these companies to go to investment conferences is that sometimes companies are very early in their developmental pathway. They're doing preclinical work and they say, oh, I don't have to worry about reimbursement because I'm going to sell to big pharma way before I have to worry about things like that. But the news is that if you can demonstrate that you're already thinking about how your technology is going to get paid for, and even if people have no idea, I tell them, just say that we're working on a reimbursement pathway, you'd be surprised how impressed a potential acquirer or strategic partner will be that you're already thinking about how your technology is going to be paid for. It will make it that much easier to achieve some of your business goals. So you can't read this, but I told you that I would tell you a little bit more about my journey on behalf of my sister-in-law and her son. who had a condition that their Blue Cross Blue Shield plan, it happened to be in Arizona, wouldn't pay for. So I looked at the labs. I knew the diagnosis, of course, and I just Googled coverage decision for this particular problem for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Arizona. And it was very specific. Now, they're not always. In this case, it was. And it mentioned what evidence was necessary for a positive coverage decision. And I found that in the labs, my nephew was borderline in some, but definitely met the criteria in others. And even though these coverage decisions are supposed to be updated annually, they aren't always. The updates depends on, or what would trigger an update to coverage policy is if it's a high procedure volume, if it's a high treatment cost per patient, if there's high demand, anything that's going to increase the costs of the plan, basically. And then maybe it shouldn't be last, but concerns over safety and or efficacy. So what I found is that the evidence that they were using was not the most up-to-date. They weren't using the most up-to-date treatment guidelines. I did a literature search, just a, PubMed lit search, and found that there were articles that were very credible that demonstrated that a lot of the lab values that my nephew had would be amenable to this technology. And ultimately, we were able to get him covered. And it's funny because, again, my sister-in-law was kind of surprised. But I've noticed in this and also in my personal life that health plans don't expect you to appeal. But appeals are successful about 85% of the time. So if you're denied personally, fight back. Get people in your corner. In my particular case, I had an orthopedic problem. I got 2 orthopedic surgeons to say that my continued physical therapy was medically necessary because they had deemed it medically unnecessary. And ultimately, it took about 4 months, but they covered everything. So do not give up, either in support of your own technology or in your personal lives. And as I mentioned, a lot of this information is available online. It's Googleable. It might be an explicit coverage policy. It might be silent so that there's no policy. You might have to ask, or it's case-by-case coverage. It may be implicit non-coverage. It doesn't say that it's not covered, but it seems like there are very few cases in which it is covered. Or there may be explicit non-coverage where they say, period, this is deemed experimental, it is not covered. And in terms of where fees fall, Medicare versus Medicaid versus private insurance reimburses at the highest payer amounts. They average about 143% of Medicare rates overall. Contrasting this to Medicaid, these rates are about 70 to 90% that of Medicare. So Medicare is squarely in the middle in terms of reimbursement rates. Commercial insurance is higher and Medicaid is lower. Now, lastly, I wanted to talk about telehealth and telemedicine, which magically became available during the pandemic. For many years, people were wringing their hands. We can't do this. We can't do telehealth. We can't do telehealth visits. We can't figure out what codes to use. Well, not only did they figure this out during the pandemic because necessity is the mother of invention, but it's really expanded beyond that and it's not going away. As a matter of fact, I recently was on 4 panels, 2 of which, this was at the Heart Rhythm Society meeting, which was really interesting. This was about 300 entrepreneurs that are developing technology that it's cardiovascular based. And 2 of the panels were surrounding digital health. And my role was to talk about reimbursement and that kind of thing, and what role artificial intelligence plays, because right now AI is mentioned in every application I look at. Rightly or wrongly, it's just thought to be the magic bullet. And we know that there can potentially be problems with it, but if used correctly, it can be useful. Now, of course, the problem is that the codes haven't necessarily caught up with use of AI. But there are different codes that are really helpful for monitoring and education, especially in digital health. You've got remote therapeutic monitoring, RTM codes, these are mostly CPT codes. So now you know all about CPT, and these are for self-reported data and digitally uploaded by the patient. These are non-physiologic data that are uploaded. Then there's RPM. I call it remote physiological. That's what I use as the P because it's physiological data. RPM, monitoring data, but some people call it remote patient monitoring, which I think is a misnomer because the physiological is much more descriptive. So unlike the RTM, which is uploaded by patients, it's patients' self-reported data, maybe from a digital watch or something else. These are services that are performed by clinical staff. Then you've got, there's always acronyms. Then you've got TCM, Transition Care Management, which is designed to help patients transition from the hospital to home. Of course, different CPT codes again. And then you have Chronic Care Management, which is the only one of the 4 of these that requires face-to-face visits. And it's to, of course, improve patient outcomes, empower patients to manage their disease, preferably remotely. So part of the problem with these codes is that there's a lot of overlap. And people ask me, well, what codes do I use? You know, you can try many of them, and many of them, except for, let's say, TCM, which is very specific, and chronic care management, patients have to have at least 2 chronic conditions that last at least 12 months that put them at significant risk of being hospitalized. So those are much more specific, I would say, in their definitions than the RTM and RPM. But if you look to see what these encompass, it helps you understand where they overlap or where they can be used separately. And then I conclude with some specific reimbursement that's for chronic care monitoring. So you can see that reimbursement is a thorny animal. In the United States, the healthcare system is very complex. We don't have a single payer. We've got multiple payers, but there are people that can help. The MACs are helpful, Medicare Administrative Contractors. A lot of times you can talk to Palmetto, which is the main MAC in the US. I actually helped somebody get a code through Palmetto. They have an online system now. Now, I needed a little bit of help because I'd never at that time, a few years ago, never done it before just by myself. So I had a colleague who had done this on a regular basis, because you really have to find, if possible, a technology that is at least similar enough to yours that you know where you fit in and what would be the appropriate CPT code for your technology. If not, they'll decide for you, and you may be reimbursed at a lower level. So I think the takeaway here is, don't forget about reimbursement, even if you're at a very early stage. Start learning about the endpoints that insurers are interested in, and think about incorporating them certainly into a clinical trial plan. But even there are proxies preclinically that you may be able to use. And this will really impress people that want to partner with you, or perhaps even that want to buy you. And so really consider reimbursement early in the development life cycle of your technology. Thanks very much for your attention.